and essentially all it is the Earth, a map of the Earth made out of little points, little cloned spheres. Essentially, that's pretty much it. There's a couple of MoGraph little tricks in here that I'm going to show you in more detail, and stuff that might help you in the future to make more efficient MoGraph setups. So you probably know already what it is. You've seen the photo. Let me just get a quick render here and just show you what's up. So essentially this is it, and that's what we're going to be making. So let's start by creating a new scene, and we're going to need two things here, which I will provide, and those are these two textures. Let me show you. An outline, a black and white outline of the Earth, of the landmass, and then we have an outline, which I just took that first one into After Effects and applied a Find Edge effect, and then I basically just filled in the edge black and made the background white and saved that out. And we're going to use this to create kind of a border on our, basically to affect our clones along the edge to be a little bit larger and a little bit brighter, and it will make just the overall shape of our grid a little more recognizable. So once we have those sorted, we're just going to open Cinema again, and we're going to import those two, like so. Wow, that is a big window. I'm sure there's a "that's what she said" joke in there somewhere, but I'll leave that to you. Alright, so in our Luminance channel, I'm just going to drag in this image, go to our desktop, and bring in the coastal one. No, that's fine for now. And I'll copy this and do the same again, except let's find the other one, the solid landmass. Okay. No. And I'm just going to call this landmass. And this one, coastline. Just so there's no confusion here. Okay, so first thing we want to do is create the sphere that we're going to clone onto. That's going to basically create our grid. We are going to just create a sphere here, and that's it. We're done. Goodbye. No, I'm kidding, obviously. Right, so I'm going to press N and B, and we're going to get our wireframe up just so we can see what we're dealing with here. Now, when we are just working on we're going to try to do this as procedurally as possible, and that means that we're going to try not to make objects editable like this by pressing CC. You'll see it's no longer an editable object with any options here. That means it's no longer parametric, and parametric just is a fancy way of saying that it's not a mathematically generated object, whereas this sphere is, and that's why we can input this data and modify our object. So the fact that we maintain it at a parametric object means that later on we can start working now like this and clone onto it, and then later on when we want more detail on our grid, we can actually just boost that up and we have twice as much detail without actually having to do any of the work at that level of detail. So I'll bring it back down to 30, and we'll start our process. So right now I'm just going to scale it up to 200 centimeters. That's 2 meters. And we are going to hide it, and we're just going to alt click on these two little circles, and it's going to disappear out of our viewport and out of our render. And that's just because we don't need it at this point. We only need the reference information. We don't actually need to do anything with it. So now that we've got that, the overall shape of our sphere, we're going to start the MoGraph process. And most people now would just say, okay, let's start with a cloner and we'll clone onto it. But that is a very inefficient way of doing it, and I will explain why. Basically, what happens when you clone is that you are creating an object, and that object gets cloned out onto our sphere, onto this sphere, onto every point, and then we would use these textures, obviously, to remove portions of those clones. And the fact that you are first cloning onto everything and then removing is a little bit inefficient. So there's a quick trick that is, it's one more step, but you end up saving a bit of time and processing power, basically. And that is to use a matrix. And we clone matrices onto it and then remove matrices, and then we clone onto the matrices as a third step. So I'll just show you what I mean. And this will be our initial, I'm not going to bother renaming it. This will be our initial cloning or cloning process. It basically allows us to turn the information of this sphere into positional point data rather than geometric data. I may have lost some of you there, but hopefully you'll understand now when I do this. So now I'm going to set my matrix to object, and we're going to get a little object dialog here. We're going to drag our sphere into it, and you'll see now we have a bunch of cubes on it. Now these cubes are very quick to render, so don't worry about that. And even if you didn't want these cubes here, you could actually just go to thinking particle. And well, whatever. If you turn thinking particle on and then turn both these off, we're left now with the position information of each of these points, which is great. So if we wanted, now you can see if we were to add more segments to the initial sphere, let's say 90, and refresh the frame, you can see now there's twice as many or even more particles on this sphere, which is great. So now I'm just going to bring it back down to 30, and we refresh like so, and that's what we're working with, which is great. So now we begin the process. Actually, I'm going to bring this back up because we actually kind of do need some more, and it's really not that rough on the computer right now. So okay, now that we have this, we are going to start the process of removing some of these particles. The great thing about the matrix is we can allow MoGraph to intersect with thinking particles. So we can just bring in a shade effector, shader, and here we're going to first of all go into our shader and select image, select an image, load image, and actually we didn't have to bring it in here at all. That was a mistake. So we're going to bring in our coastal, or our map, our black and white map, landmass map. I'm just going to say no. And in parameters, I'm going to go over here to parameters. We're going to turn off scale, and we're going to go down here to visibility. And this is a neat little feature that MoGraph has that a lot of people don't realize exists. And what it does is, rather than scaling it down to -1, which would essentially make it invisible, we use the visibility option, and this doesn't just scale it down to 0, it completely removes that clone from our MoGraph system. And so if we were later to clone, well, when we clone onto our matrix later, we save ourselves the power, the memory consumption of cloning onto everything and then removing, if you know what I mean, because we've already done the removal process. We're just cloning onto what we need. So hopefully that makes sense, and we'll see. So I'm going to call this shader landmass, just so we know what it is we're doing here. And you'll notice that even though we turned that on, nothing's happened here. That might be because it hasn't refreshed yet, but probably not. For now, I'm just going to turn the matrix on so we can see what's going on. And the thinking particles are still there, but you can see something's going on here. There's some chunks missing, and and basically it looks like it's inverted. The black is removing our matrices, and the white is keeping them on. So this is pretty easy to fix. We don't actually have to take it into Photoshop and invert it or anything. I'm actually just going to turn off thinking particles for now. So all we have to do is go into our landmass effector, the shader, and if we go into effector, there's a little drop down here called min max, and if we invert the maximum and minimum, that essentially inverts the effect it has on our MoGraph. So here we go. So now you can start to see the map come to life, and it's starting to look pretty good, which is great. It's pretty neat, and you can see that as we increase our segments in the original sphere, our landmass becomes a little bit more obvious, and we could actually just to make it even clearer, scale these little blocks down a little bit more, and we get this. So that's already looking pretty sweet. And right now, what you could do is, well, this won't render. There's no geometry here whatsoever yet. That's the beauty of the matrix. It's not generating anything, so we can do all this removal process with relative ease for our computer. So now that we've got our position information that we're happy with, we can hide the matrix, and we're going to add a cloner into the scene. And to the cloner, we're going to add a child of a sphere. So hold Shift and click on the sphere, and it will add it as a child. And I'm just going to drag this down to 3 segments and make this radius, let's say 5. Let's say 2. A radius of 2. Right now our cloner is set to linear mode, so we're going to change that to object, and our object is going to be the matrix. So hopefully now you'll kind of start to understand what is going on. Now it's a little bit slow off the bat, so what we can do to help is choose render instances, and now we should be able to move around it relatively easily. And if we render now, we should get our grid. It's starting to come together. Now there is something I like to do, which is basically make the main landmass a little bit smaller, the points a little bit thinner, and the edges quite a bit thicker and brighter, just to make the outline really clear. So what we can do is basically scale down. If we scale down our sphere a little bit more, let's say 1, like that, and then we create a copy of our landmass shader effector, and I'm just gonna rename it and call it coastline, and we apply this to our cloner. So now we have that applied, we go into our coastline effector, we turn off visibility, we don't want this anymore. We are going to go into our parameters and turn on scale again. And we're going to scale up to 1 point, let's say 8. And right now it's just going to affect everything because it's using the same shader that we defined earlier. So we're going to go in and change this to the coastline shader, like so. And now you'll see where the first shader effector overlaps the second coastline shader effector. We get a little increase in the size of the particle or the clone. So now we get these nice kind of like offset sizes, and I think it's a little bit big right now, so we're going to just bring it down to 1.5 maybe, like so. And come around here to North America. And And that's looking pretty cool. Right now it's a little ambiguous because you see right through and you're not sure where the landmass is. We could up the segments to 250 here. And hit play. Now they get a little bit denser. I might bring down this a little bit more, so maybe 1.3. And essentially that's pretty much it. Another thing I like to do is just to add a little bit more variation, make it a little bit more natural looking. And I add a random effector to our cloner. And I turn off position. Actually, if you use the position, that looks kind of cool. Make it just on the Y. And you can do some pretty cool stuff. But I'm not going to show you how to animate it. I'm just showing you how to set it up, and then you can go nuts and do some cool shit with it. So we're just going to affect the scale a little bit, and go turn on uniform scale, and we're going to maybe scale it down to 0.8. Maybe. Yeah, I think that's fine. Maybe 0.2. Just to get a little bit of unevenness. And here you can see it's working nicely. Just feels a little bit more natural. And finally, one thing I do like to do when rendering this sort of setup is to add some depth of field. And the depth of field goes a long way to let you really see the detail on one side and kind of blur out the back. So let's say we wanted to see America, a little bit of North America and some South America. So we're just going to place our camera here in the middle. Get out of my camera just to make sure the focal point is where it should be. And it's way off. So just pull that back up here. Okay, and I shouldn't have done that. So now that we're in our camera, we've got that turned on. We'll go into our render settings, which I've got here. That's fine, whatever, I don't mind. All I want to do is turn on physical and depth of field. I'll set this to medium for now. Now that alone isn't going to be enough. What we have to do now is go into our camera, and there's going to be a physical tab, and here there is the f-stop option, and we're going to bring it way down to 0.08, I think, and we'll just hit render and see. And there we go. Now we're getting some nice bokehing and some blur in the back, and we're really seeing the detail pop here on the front, which is exactly what we were looking for. And that's pretty much it. If you guys wanted to even add some rotation to this and or something like that, what you could do is apply a time effector. And a time effector, basically all it does is modify based on the current frame. So as the frame increases, your modification increases. So 90 frames or 90 degrees is gonna make it spin quite fast, so I'll just hit play and let you see what that looks like. Oh, what's actually happening is it's moving each clone 90 degrees, so if we were to set it to object, that won't do anything either. I think what we have to do is actually remove it from our cloner. And we're going to actually modify the original sphere rather than the clones that come after it. So all you have to do is place those two things in a null object, Alt-G to group them. And in theory, that should work. And it's not working for some reason. I think maybe because our deformer is turned off. If we set that to object, now it starts to spin. So you can actually use, this is a fun little trick, you can actually use MoGraph effectors on Geo as a sort of effector, like a deformer. And you can do some cool stuff without actually having to put it into, let's say, a fracture object just to be able to use the time effector. Just group it and it should work as long as you have the deformer set to object or polygon or point or whatever. A little example of this is, let's say, you want to randomize a sphere. This is a little, going on a little tangent here, but just to show you my point. If we have our sphere here, and we group it, and then throw in, let's say, random effector. Where is it? Random? I think it moved around there a little bit. No, maybe not. But if we set it to polygon, you can see we are getting the same effect that we would with a deformer. But now we have the power of MoGraph on our hands, so we can actually go into here, into, let's say, turbulence, and get some nice movement going really quickly, and really control it to look however we want. And I'm not too sure, but I think the delay might actually work in here. Let's find out. I'm curious to see. I think it's actually working there. Yeah, I think it works. That's pretty neat. So you can actually use the delay effector too, which is interesting. And that is how you create the geosphere from my everyday. This was actually a tutorial I was asked a lot to do from a number of people, and I thought I'd just upload it for your enjoyment. So I hope you guys learned something, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop it in the comments or whatever. And talk to you guys soon.